There's a verse that just popped in my head. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Said some of you had snow or driving on your way to church this morning. Did you know that there is proper etiquette for the use of napkins? Did you know that? I did not know that. I'm from northeastern Kentucky, and etiquette is sometimes not high on the list of priorities. In a restaurant, for example, you're to remove the napkin, unfold it, and put it in your lap. You are not to shake it open. Okay, you're not to do that. Oops, for me. You're not to clean the cutlery with your napkin. You are not to clean cutlery with your napkin in a restaurant. There's another oops for me. You are not to wipe your face or your nose with your napkin. There's 3 oops in a row for me. And you should never refold or wad your napkin, but place it loosely folded on the table to signal you are finished. I've got 4 oops in a row, by the way. So there's 4 adequate rules for about using your napkin in a restaurant. I basically have broken all 4 of them. In college, we had a freshman class called orientation, and one of the lessons was about proper etiquette. The professor prepared this scrumptious meal and had an elegant table setting prepared to show us how to behave in a very nice restaurant. Now again, this is in college in northeastern Kentucky. The first 2 people at the table did extremely well. The second 2 students at the table did extremely well. But the third couple, however, decided it was time to break up the tension just a little bit. And there was a can of whipped cream sitting on the table for the dessert. And just as the professor walked by, the girl in that group of 2, she took the whipped cream and put it on her pie. And then as he walked back by after he had served them, she asked him to come back to the table. He did, and she doused him in whipped cream from head to toe, and he was wearing a formal tux. And the class exploded in laughter, and to my knowledge, he never tried that experiment again. I think having a meal with Jesus would be exciting. To sit and listen to the Lord talk about miracles he had performed, lives he had changed, and hearts he had made whole. I think there would be some serious moments with Jesus at the table, but I think there would probably be some humorous ones where the guests would enjoy lots of laughter. Sometimes the laughter is intended. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes there can be that moment of shock at a meal. Sometimes there can be that moment of embarrassment. Barb, Adam, and I had only been here for a few months, and we were invited to dinner at one of our members' homes, who was also hosting a missionary couple who was visiting that same time. Our son Adam was barely 2 years old. He was playing in the front room of this member's house. He had a Matchbox car. He loved Matchbox cars. And he was driving the car on their hardwood floor, and he pushed the car across the room, and it went under a big rug. He reached his hand under the rug where the car was, pulled it out, stood up, lifted the corner of the rug and went, ooh, dust. And Barb and I were ready to crawl under that rug since we were guests in that home. How would you react if you were hosting a meal and the guest was going to be Jesus? Would you scurry around tidying everything, vacuuming, dusting, picking up the clothes off the floor? Well, the episode in Jesus' life we're going to study today is one where he's going into a home with some good friends and a meal is being prepared. And it is a meal where differences about people are going to be learned and differences in personalities. But it's also a reminder for us to prioritize Jesus every day in our lives. We've been studying during the months of March and April the Gospel of Luke in this series entitled Come Hungry, where we're taking a peek at Jesus when he's having a meal. So I want you to turn to Luke chapter 10 this morning. It's going to be the last couple of paragraphs in Luke chapter 10. And the meal that we're going to talk about today is primarily about one that is being prepared. We actually don't encounter the meal itself, but we encounter the preparations leading up to the meal. It's found in Luke chapter 10, beginning with verse 38, going to the end of the chapter at verse 42. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Dutch artist Johannes Vermeer did a painting in 1665 entitled Christ in the House of Martha and Mary that was very popular during that century. But we're going to notice today the setting and the significance of this encounter that Mary and Martha had with Jesus. So let's begin with the setting. This encounter with Jesus occurs in the home of some of his best friends, Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus. Their home is located in the village of Bethany. Bethany was 2 miles east of Jerusalem on the other side of the Mount of Olives. Now, this is the first time it's mentioned that Jesus is in this house, but it certainly would not have been the first time he had met Mary and Martha and Lazarus. In fact, many Bible scholars suggest that based on other studies, that Jesus probably had an open invitation to this home, and that it was often a place of retreat and rest for him. Do you have friends whose home you know you can just walk into? You don't have to be invited. You maybe even have a key to the house. You have the password to their internet. You can just walk in and retreat there. Well, for the past 18 months, Jesus had been in the upper part of Israel and Galilee, and now he is back in Judea, and he is rekindling this friendship. Now, it's been suggested that maybe Lazarus met Jesus in the city of Jerusalem at some kind of Jewish feast and invited him over to Bethany for a meal. And Mary and Martha had been working together to prepare a banquet for their friend and this famed rabbi named Jesus. Now, understand this was not a small task. Jesus usually traveled with at least 12 of his disciples, sometimes more. It is believed that Mary and Martha had a very large house representing some degree of wealth. It would be in this very same house just 2 months later that Jesus would be called to by Mary and Martha because their brother Lazarus had died. But once Jesus arrives at this house, Mary walks out and leaves her sister to do all the work while she sits at Jesus' feet and listens to him teach. And here's where we're going to see the differences between these two sisters. Martha appears to be energetic and responsible hostess, whereas Mary is the attentive, conscientious listener. And these two divergent personalities in the middle of this bustling social situation sets the scene for some conflict. Now, my mother and one of her sisters, she had 3 sisters, my mother and one of her sisters were complete opposites in personality. My mother was somewhat always unfiltered. My son Adam said his mama was always very unfiltered with her language and other things and her approach to life. We could go out to eat with my mother, and she would literally grab the server and say, honey, that hairstyle on you doesn't go very well. Here's the card for my stylist. She could really help improve that. You ought to go check it out. Or she might say to a server walking by that's not even our server, she would say, you know, that outfit really doesn't do your body any favors. You ought to try to some other kind of clothing. And we always just wanted to slide under the table whenever my mother was with us. But her one sister, my Aunt Alberta, was always calm and reserved and very congenial. And after both of them had become widows, my Aunt Alberta would go to my mother's house and stay there for a week or 2 at a time, and she did that for 3 or 4 times a year for about 4 or 5 years. And I would call and check on my mom every night. And when my Aunt Alberta was there, sometimes she would answer the phone. And I'd say, Alberta, I'm just calling to check in to see how you and Mom are getting along. How's it going? And she would just usually say, well, as usual, I'm trying to restrain your mother. She said sometimes physically, sometimes her mouth, but she said usually that's what I spend my time doing when I'm here at your mom's, is trying to restrain her. Now, there is both here in this passage a logistical issue and a cultural issue. The logistical issue is Mary walked out and left her sister Martha to complete the preparations for this large meal. The cultural issue is that in sitting at the feet of Jesus, Mary was assuming the role of a disciple, which in that particular day was considered to be characteristically a male role. And so Martha is racing back and forth between the kitchen and the table. She's trying to finish the meal preparations, and she sees is Mary sitting at Jesus' feet. And Martha's frustration begins to build. Luke says Martha was distracted by all the preparation. She was just overburdened with a lot of busyness. You know, some people are more task-oriented when relating to others. They're eager to serve. They have almost superhuman ability when it comes to seeing a need and fulfilling it. They see an empty glass at the table, they've got to fill it. They see a bowl running out of mashed potatoes, they got to grab it and fill it. That would be my wife. There is nothing wrong with task-oriented temperaments. If we didn't have people like that in the world, our world would grind to a halt. But Martha's problem was she was paying too much attention to the preparations for her guest that she stopped paying attention to the guest. And finally, her frustration gets to a boiling point, and she lashes out at both her sister and the Lord. Now, you have to have some guts to lash out at Jesus. And Martha did. She said, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work all by myself?" And then she looks at Jesus and says, "You tell her to help me." Now, although Martha's a little bit rude here due to her frenzy and a little bit presumptuous to tell Jesus what to do, her request is still reasonable. Tell her to help me. By the way, the word there for help in the original language of the New Testament, Greek language, occurs only twice. One of them is here, and the other one is in Romans chapter 8, verse 26, when we need help from the Lord. Paul writes, "In the same way the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans." Martha believed the Lord could help her. Jesus gives Martha a mild rebuke. Now, she's probably expecting some kind of affirmation from Jesus because of her sacrificial service, and He looks at her and He says, "Martha, Martha." The doubling of her name there indicates that He had a deep emotion for her. That this wasn't a voice of disappointment, it wasn't a voice of disapproval, it was rather a voice of compassion. I think Jesus understood her frustration, but appreciated her desire to serve everybody who was there. He was saying, "I can see that you care, Martha, but maybe you care too much about some of these tedious details." See, Martha was fretting over all these little details, and she was neglecting the most important matter, which was listening to Jesus. I think Martha was trying to prepare a very lavish meal and could have prepared a very simple one that her guest could have readily enjoyed. During my weekend ministry in college, it was customary that a family would invite me to their house for a Sunday lunch or take me out to lunch on Sunday afternoon after church, a tradition that needs to be reinstated. There was a sign-up sheet on the bulletin board at the church, and each Sunday I would go and look at the sign-up sheet and see whose name was by that particular date, whether I was going out to lunch with them or they were taking me to their house. And Margaret Haley was the lady's name that was in charge of the preacher's lunch sign-up list. And in my 4 years there during college, a couple of times, she would stand up at the end of the church, and church building was about the size of this one section right here. So, I mean, the whole church building could fit in this one section. Small church, there would be maybe 80 or 90 of us in church on any one given Sunday. And she would stand up at the end of the church and goes, "Okay, I need to let you know the Feed the Preacher list is empty. You all need to fill it, or he's going to show up at my house every Sunday." And so people would sign up again, and sometimes I'd still end up at her house. And people did what Margaret said, because Margaret was 6'6". And she was a very tall lady, and she was a very boisterous type person. But I noticed when Margaret would sign up to feed me, she often would not come to church that Sunday. And I asked her husband, Bob, about it, and he said, "Well, Margaret stays home so she can have time to fix you a really good home-cooked meal." And after a couple of times that, I finally had to tell Margaret, I really think you need to be in church rather than skip it and fix the meal. You need to be in worship first, then you worry about the meal later. Later, I had to tell her, I said, "Margaret, if you keep skipping, I'm just not going, so when you sign up for me, if you're not in church that Sunday, I'm just not going to show up." And she never missed church again for that reason. Everybody else in this room that was with Jesus was spending time with Jesus except one, and that was Martha. And Mary had set aside the worries of the world to focus on what was eternal. She ignored the trivial matters to immerse herself in the teachings of Jesus. You see, in 5 short months, Jesus was going to be gone. And Mary was very perceptive about this special opportunity. Is there plenty to be worried about and upset about in this world? Is there enough in this world to distract you yet? Is there enough to grab your attention on any given day, any given Sunday, about things that can distract you away from Jesus? Hyperinflation, pandemic, job, children, political environment, health. And what we need more of is time with Jesus to help soothe our worries and give us strength to get through times that can be difficult. Now, there is some very significant things from this story. From this short story of Mary and Martha and their encounter of Jesus, I see a couple of applications for us today that I think we need to come hungry for more of Jesus to keep ourselves spiritually strong. Here's the first one. Open your home to Jesus completely. Open your home to Jesus completely. Jesus Christ should be the unseen guest in every aspect of our home lives. There's a plaque that reads, Christ is the head of this house, the unseen guest at every meal, the silent listener to every conversation. Parents, the priority you really want for your children are demonstrated by the atmosphere created in the home. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus created an atmosphere where Jesus felt welcomed. Would he be welcomed in our homes today? If the only bit of Jesus your child is getting through the week is here at church for an hour or two, they're not going to be committed to the Lord when they become adults. The major teaching and example of a Christ-like life has to come within the walls of the home, not the walls of the church. And that means we have to be careful not to become distracted spiritually. And so Mary sat at the feet of Jesus listening and ignoring her sister's calls for help, because Mary knew this opportunity probably would only come once as Jesus began heading towards Jerusalem and the cross. The Gospel of Luke focuses on Jesus' journey towards the cross more than the other three Gospel writers. In fact, Luke dedicates 10 chapters of Jesus making his journey back to Jerusalem to the cross. And in Luke 9:51, it says, as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And the meaning of that word resolutely means to have an unwavering determination that Jesus was not going to allow anyone or anything to sway him from the mission to which God had called him. And even when Jesus was offered a meal after 40 days of fasting, he told Satan, man shall not live on bread alone. And Satan wasn't trying to get Jesus to perform some magic by turning stones into bread. He was attempting to get the Lord to give in to his physical needs over his spiritual needs. And the battle between the flesh and the spirit is very real. You know, even Jesus needed to eat physically. Martha was busy preparing herself and preparing the physical food while Jesus was giving Mary the spiritual food. Jesus often shared meals with those who need to reprioritize their lives. Robert Karras has out a little book entitled Eating Your Way Through Luke's Gospel. He writes, Jesus enjoys an inclusive table, be it with toll collectors, sinners, men, women, hostile religious leaders, even fallible disciples. He shares his last earthly meal with a disciple who will betray him, with disciples who yearn for positions of power, and with Peter who will deny him. If Jesus sat at your dinner table, what would he hear about your day? In this story, he heard Martha reach a very high level of frustration. Even when things go rough at your house, can you reflect Jesus? Is there grace offered when needed? Benjamin West was just trying to be a good babysitter for his little sister Sally, and while his mother was out, Benjamin found some bottles of colored ink and proceeded to paint Sally's portrait. But by the time Mrs. West returned home, ink blots stained the table, the chairs, and the floor. And Benjamin's mother surveyed the mess without a word until she saw the picture. And picking up the picture, she said, "This is Sally." And she bent down and she kissed her young son. In 1763, when he was 25 years old, Benjamin West was selected as the history painter to England's King George III. And when asked how he got into painting, he replied, "My mother's kiss and my mother's grace made me a painter." What if Benjamin West's mother had lost her cool, started yelling, missed on the final outcome, which was the painting of her daughter? Jesus didn't want Martha to miss out on what was most important, time with him. And the atmosphere in your home demonstrates what's really important in your life. Are mealtimes the only time you pray? Mom and dads, do your children hear you pray for them? One little boy said he knew his mother prayed for him because she said, "May God help you if you ever do that again." Is there anything in your house that would discourage Jesus' presence? If he walked through and he opened your cabinets, crawled into your attic, opened the history browser on your computer, would he find anything distasteful to him? Preacher and Bible scholar G. Campbell Morgan told about how his father visited his home shortly after he was first married. His father walked into this new home of his son and his daughter-in-law, and he began walking around, and he walked through the house going from room to room, and he would look into each room, and he said, "Yes, all very nice." But then he said, "Nobody will know by walking through your house whether you belong to God or the devil." And Morgan said that he made up his mind right then and there would be no room in their house that did not convey some type of message, a picture, a book, something that would tell every visitor that Jesus Christ is the Lord of their home. And sometimes it's not only we need to add things to our homes, there might be sometimes we need to take some things out of our homes. Maybe need to remove some magazines. Maybe need to get rid of some television channels, some pill bottles, some internet sites, some attitudes, some words that would be distasteful to Jesus. Open your home to Jesus completely. A second lesson here would be this: open your heart to worship regularly. Open your heart to worship regularly. Martha became distracted and worried about some minor issues, and she allowed herself to miss time with Jesus. Now, by the way, Martha was not a bad person. What happened is she simply allowed other distractions to get her attention when she should have been worshiping. Jesus said in Matthew 6:33, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." Preacher Jeff Walling, who's now on staff at Pepperdine University, coined a term about this passage in Luke. He says a lot of Christians develop what he calls Marthaplexy. Marthaplexy, he defines, is when one confuses ministry for God with the relationship with God. It's confusing ministry for God with the relationship with God. And Jesus rebukes Martha, and yet she is preparing a meal for him. By the way, that's why here at church we want you to commit to regularly worshiping Jesus before serving him. One reason is if you serve and that's your primary function, you're going to burn out and you're not going to be effective for very long. But another is you're setting an example in your serving when you're first worshiping. So we ask that all volunteers regularly worship in a worship service on Sunday morning and not just come to fulfill a duty and then go home. Serving is great, but missing time with the Lord in worship begins eroding the relationship you should have with him. Let's say you're inviting some family and friends to Easter worship with you, but as it gets closer and you get busy, you decide to stay home from church on Easter Sunday and fix the meal. Your guests arrive, whom you invited to church, and they come to church, and yet they didn't even see you. You're telling them that serving is a priority, but worship isn't. And the basis for serving is always to be our relationship we first have with Christ. And if that begins to erode or it doesn't get the attention it needs, the actual serving is not going to last anyway. A husband asked his wife one day, said, "What are you making for Easter dinner this year?" She said, "Reservations." One of the things I have appreciated about the Christman family, who Greg just prayed over a few moments ago, is their commitment to worshiping every Sunday with a body of believers. And I know they have spent the last year plus preparing and trying to organize themselves to get to the Netherlands. But even during their travel schedule and trying to raise financial support and trying to connect with as many churches as possible, they regularly worshiped. And for the last year plus, they've made Tri-Village their church home. And I know they've had to miss a few Sundays to raise some support, and that gets very tiring. And I know that the Sundays following, when they've been on the road a lot, it would be easy just to say, let's just stay home. Let's not be in church today. Nobody's going to really notice anyway. And so I've really appreciated their commitment. I literally think that I can probably count on one hand the number of times the entire Christmas family's not been here in the last year. That's how committed they have been to worshiping regularly to make sure first they themselves are getting fed before they go out and try to serve Christ to feed Him to others. If there is something that distracts you from worshiping Jesus Christ regularly, it's really time to reevaluate your priorities. It might be busyness in your life. It might be Satan just trying to distract you from the Lord. Louis Giglio has a book out entitled, "Don't Give the Enemy a Seat at Your Table." And in that book, he writes about how each person has to win the battle of the mind. And interspersed throughout the book is a lot of examples of tables and Jesus being the good shepherd. One of the chapters is about the 23rd Psalm and verse 5. Verse 5 of 23rd Psalm says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." And Giglio takes that verse and uses an analogy that there are all kinds of folks encircling the table with you and Jesus. And these people encircling this table represent things like troubles and stress and problems and calamity and pressure and anxiety and depression, addiction, divorce, family collapse. But as you look around and you see all these folks and you feel the weight that you have upon your shoulders, you hear the Good Shepherd say, "Please sit down." And you think you would. But in today's world, often our response is this: I need to turn around and address this situation first. Then I will eat with you. Isn't that exactly what Martha did? Didn't she first look around at all that she needed to accomplish before first spending time with the Lord? You are to be commended for being here on a Sunday morning, a snowy Sunday morning, on the last Sunday of March, to say, I want to make this a priority. Giglio writes, "The Good Shepherd is sitting at your table. Jesus has invited you to all the abundance He offers. It's a meal for the two of you. He Himself is the feast." Are you feasting on Jesus so then you can serve others and they can learn about Him? Open your heart to worship regularly so you first feast with Jesus and then you can serve faithfully and not miss out on what He can do for you. Let's pray. Father, this morning, we thank You that there are all kinds of different personalities in this world because we actually need all of them. It would be a very stale and dry and uninteresting world if we all had the exact same personality. But in this story of Mary and Martha, it's a reminder that no matter what our personalities may be, there is to be a commitment to priority of evaluating daily where You are in our lives. Lord, for each person who serves and volunteers in this place, we are very grateful. But we want each person to serve faithfully and continually, and so we want them to worship You regularly. And we want to be sure that our homes are open to Christ completely. May they be places where He is free to enter. And so as He enters our home, may we enter places where Jesus goes. And in this time of our hearts, may we enter that time where Jesus went to die as He headed towards the cross, as He headed towards Jerusalem, and He focused on the mission to which You had called Him. For it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.